While you're out here, will you be going to In-N-Out? And is there anything you can do at a federal level to take on the quality of the fries?
Thank you for saying this.
People need to talk about it.
Thank you for saying this, because every time I come out here, everyone's like, oh my God, In-N-Out, In-N-Out. And I'm like, my controversial non-political opinion is that it's overrated.
Yeah. You just watched the absolute tail end of Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's interview with Pod Save America. And that is the clip that the left has kind of been losing its mind about online. Now, if the entire interview was just nonsense talk about In-N-Out, I'd be pretty frustrated. I'd be pretty annoyed. You've got other things to talk about. The nation is grappling with so many issues. But I want to reiterate, after watching the entirety of her interview, that was literally the last part of the conversation. And I will note that she is correct about In-N-Out fries specifically. All right, now with that said, I wanted to provide one example of someone I like, someone who's a friend of the show, someone who agrees with us on many political issues, and that's David Sirota. He highlighted that clip, which was tweeted out by PodSave, and said, I think it's really something that elected left leaders will eagerly be invited by corporate Democrat hosts who created neoliberalism that destroyed the left, but rarely ever accept interview requests from actual left outlets that might ask real questions. Okay, so there's a lot there. While the hosts of PodSave are certainly those who promote and provide cover for the neoliberal policies that have definitely destroyed the Democratic Party and the country, I think it's unfair to say they created neoliberalism, but nonetheless, they certainly promote it and did so under the Obama administration, and it was a disaster. So that point is well taken, but let's not overstate their involvement. They didn't create neoliberalism; they're just adherents of neoliberalism, and obviously, I'm not for that. But the other thing that David Sirota mentions is that AOC, agrees to go on this Pod Save America show, but hasn't really been doing a lot of left-wing media. She has done some left-wing media in the past, but just from personal experience, yeah, she could be doing more. I'm not gonna disagree with that. She kind of has gone in a completely different direction in terms of her media appearances. She's probably a little uncomfortable because it's difficult to decipher in this independent media space who the good faith actors are and who the lunatics are, so I don't know if that's what's scaring her a little bit, but she should definitely talk to more left-wing media outlets, because it's not a good look when those who supported your campaign, helped you get elected, are the very people that you're no longer having any communication with. That's not cool. But I also don't want to make this about like, oh, she won't come on our show. Let me be clear, I don't care. Like I'm gonna talk about AOC no matter what. Like I don't need her to come on the show for us. She should come on the show for her, right? She should be talking to left-wing voters because that bodes well for her campaigning, and also what she purports to want to accomplish in Congress. So just want to be clear about that. But with that said, I do think it's important to watch the entirety of the interview, because I think she made good points, right? So sure, be critical of her refusal to go on left-wing media, but let's start with this first video that talks about, a topic that we discuss here on the show quite often, how Dems need to do a better job talking about corporate greed and how it's contributed to inflation.
I think that we can beef up and be more aggressive in talking about root causes of inflation being corporate greed. This is not, inflation is kind of spoken about as this really vague kind of floaty concept, but that we're all feeling, right? Yeah. Prices of things are going up, but we don't really talk about why. And we need to have a real confrontation about the consolidation of market power and the fact that increasingly the most basic goods that we have, housing, food, etc., are concentrating into oligopolies, and that it is these huge corporations that are price gouging just because they can, just because they want to.
She's right about that. I show you that clip because to basically sum up her appearance on Pod Save as nothing more than, again, nonsense talk about In-N-Out is ridiculous. Again, that was like at the very end of the interview. She talked about the failures of the Democratic Party. And she also kind of weighed in on recent polling that shows fears of losing our democracy don't happen to be a priority for most American voters. And she addressed that in the next clip in a way that left me wanting more. So let's watch that and I'll explain why.
You ask most voters what they care about, and inflation tops the list, abortion access tops the list. And I think, in the New York Times poll, it was like 7% of people said threats of democracy in the way that we think about it, election denial, all that kind of other stuff. There was also like 40% of people would be willing to vote for an election denier. How do you balance the need to make sure people understand the threat that we're facing, with also speaking to people's immediate concerns?
A lot of elections, a lot of times, are driven by very short-term issues, thinking, and priorities. And when you see this jockeying over narratives, it's about what we make urgent and how we respond to the urgent issues in our society right now.
What I want the Democratic Party to understand is that their campaigning that mostly focuses on threats to our democracy if Republicans win maybe isn't as effective, because if you're saying like electoralism is what's going to save you, clearly it has not saved the American people, right? I mean, think about how Democrats might campaign on certain things, like let's say, passing a voting rights bill, which is incredibly important to do at a time when red states are engaging in voter suppression legislation. When you have states like Arizona grappling with vigilantes showing up at ballot drop-off boxes to intimidate voters. Like, yeah, we need to support, bolster, security around our electoral system, and ensure that people who are eligible to vote can easily vote without intimidation, without fear. But it's also important to understand that when you keep talking about how important our democracy is, maybe that doesn't really resonate with people who have engaged in the electoral system and have noticed a pretty significant decline in their quality of life. When you have Democrats, specifically in Georgia, doing whatever it took to ensure that 2 Democrats won those Senate runoff races following the 2020 presidential election. And then they get told by the Democratic Party that they're not even gonna try for voting rights. When voters are told that the federal government, under the leadership of the Democratic Party is going to pass much needed police reform, and then it doesn't happen. So when you talk about the importance of protecting our democracy, I totally agree. But you also have to understand that maybe the public, at least some portion of the public, is looking at our democracy and thinking, I don't know, I mean, what has our democracy done for us? And that's dangerous. Like, that's a dangerous place to be. So I would have liked to see more talk of those failures by the Democratic Party, the fact that they did not deliver on simple things like increasing the federal minimum wage. I think that has more to do with why a lower percentage of Americans put threats to democracy as their top priority when it comes to voting issues. So the other thing, of course, is we have a 2-party system that has been completely taken over by corporate interests. And luckily, AOC did weigh in on that. So let's go to that video.
Are overwhelmingly beholden to special interests. Our entire political system is designed to be very, very acquiescent to money. And the difference is that Republicans, that is part of Republican ideology, is to support corporate America. I think the Democratic Party, we really struggle because we're supposed to be the party of the working class. But in reality, there's a lot in our big tent. It's highly segmented. And I think that there is a lot of objections from that within our party, which prevents us from being as forceful on these issues as we can be.
So nothing is forcing, what she said there is right, but I also want to follow up by saying nothing is forcing the actual progressive wing of this big tent Democratic Party from fighting back against the nefarious corporate controlled wing of the Democratic Party. And I think a lot of the frustration toward AOC is that we haven't seen much of that. So for those who have been critical of AOC, I'm not saying like, don't criticize her. There's never a time you should, no, you should criticize her when it makes sense. And there's been this acquiescence, I think, with the moderate Democrats, at least the optics are there, that make progressive voters pretty frustrated with her. But the other thing I want to mention, because this is super important, is that any real change that's ever occurred in this country was never accomplished through electoral politics alone. Electoralism and electoral politics, honestly, engaging in it is the bare minimum. The utility is overstated, and I think intentionally overstated to discourage people from doing more. And what do I mean by doing more? By organizing, by having a strategy in place, an outside pressure campaign in place that incentivizes the progressive wing of the Democratic Party to do what they were elected to do. If there is no accountability, if there is no outside pressure campaign, a well-organized outside pressure campaign, I'm not talking about random podcasters or progressive shows just tweeting their outrage. I'm talking about actual organized labor like we've had in our nation's history, which did bode well for the New Deal era. If we don't have that now, we're not gonna get what we want. Change doesn't just happen by casting a ballot and then going to brunch or going home and hoping for the best. The reason why the Republican Party does what it does, unfortunately, is because they've got this right-wing media ecosystem, of course, that's very supportive of what they're up to. But more importantly, I mean, think about how scared Republican members of Congress are of their base. And it's because they apply the right amount of pressure to get what they want. And I don't see that on the left. So that goes to just the bigger point. There are no saviors in Congress. There's never gonna be a day in which we elect one fire breather and that fire breather is gonna save us. That's not gonna happen. I think that's an incredibly childish way of looking at politics. And also it completely erases some of the successes the left and in particular organized labor has had in this country in the past. So I'm just keeping that real. And again, you wanna criticize AOC for not talking to left-wing media enough, fine. But let's be realistic about the utility of electoral politics. And let's also be realistic about the lack of, organized pressure on the outside to basically hold progressives accountable when they don't do what we want. When you have an AOC who's willing to abstain on a vote that gives the right-wing Israeli government an additional $1 billion in military aid. She felt the pressure from her fellow moderate Democrats, but clearly she didn't feel the pressure from us. And that's saying something.